My ex-wife and I had been divorced for almost a year, but we still needed to settle things with the cabin. We bought it together a few years back, deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. It was meant to be our escape from the world, a place to reconnect. But things didn't work out, and now we had to meet one last time to figure out what to do with it. I arrived first. The drive seemed longer than usual, probably because I hadn't been there since the split. The cabin looked the same, but it felt different, like it was holding on to memories that had turned sour. I unlocked the door and went inside. The air was musty, and dust had covered everything. I lit a fire in the old stone fireplace to warm up the place, then sat on the worn-out couch waiting. Late in the afternoon, she finally showed up. I saw her car through the window. She stepped out, looking just as I remembered. Maybe a little more tired, a little more worn out. She didn't come in right away. I could see her outside, staring at the cabin, maybe thinking about what we had lost. When she finally came inside, there was no need for words. We both knew why we were there. I showed her around, pointing out things that needed fixing. She nodded, but I could tell she was just as eager to leave as I was. The place held too many old memories. After we made our decisions, we went our separate ways in the cabin, checking on different things. I went to the back where the woods met the edge of the property. The trees were thick, and the shadows had started to stretch out, making everything look darker. I felt uneasy standing there, like something was watching me from the trees. I shook off the feeling and went back inside. She was in the kitchen, looking through the cupboards. I went to the bedroom, the one we used to share. The bed was still there, covered in an old quilt. I sat on the edge, staring out the window at the woods. The same uneasy feeling came back, stronger this time. Something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the cabin felt different, like it had changed since we were last there. I stood up and walked out of the room, heading back to the living room. She was there, sitting on the couch, staring into the fire. I sat down across from her, trying to ignore the feeling creeping up my spine. The fire crackled, and the shadows danced on the walls. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. I felt like I needed to get out of there, but I didn't want to leave her alone. As the sun started to set, I suggested we leave. She agreed. We gathered our things and stepped outside. The air was colder now, and the woods were darker. As we walked to our cars, I glanced back at the cabin. It looked empty, like it was waiting for something or someone. We didn't say goodbye. We just got into our cars and drove off. I didn't look back again. The road out of the woods was long and winding, but I was glad to be on it. I kept driving, the cabin fading from my mind with each mile. A few days later, I got a call from her. She was staying at her sister's place, far from the cabin, but she said she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She felt like she was being watched, like something had followed her from the cabin. I didn't know what to say. I had felt the same thing, but I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to believe that the cabin had any hold on us. But as the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling either. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the cabin, dark and empty, waiting in the woods. That's when I realized it wasn't the cabin that had changed. It was us. The cabin was just a place made of wood and stone. But we had left something behind, something we couldn't get rid of no matter how far we drove. The cabin had become a part of us, a part we couldn't escape. It was always there, waiting, watching, and no matter where we went, it followed. The cabin was just a building, but what we left behind had become something else, something we couldn't run from. The scariest part? I began to notice that wherever I went, I felt that same eerie presence. Every place I stayed, every new location, seemed to carry a hint of that same unsettling feeling. I would wake up in the middle of the night to hear faint creaks and see shadows moving just beyond my vision. The silence was never truly quiet, always filled with a subtle, almost imperceptible sound of something or someone lurking just out of sight. One night, while lying in bed, I felt a cold breath on my neck and heard a whisper that I couldn't quite make out. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked around the room, but nothing was there. Yet the feeling of being watched never left. I realized then that the cabin had followed me, not as a place but as a presence, a lingering shadow that had become part of my life. Now, every time I move or change my surroundings, I keep expecting that feeling to go away, but it doesn't. I have come to understand that no matter where I go, that part of me, that piece of the cabin's dark past, will always be with me, waiting, watching. And that thought is what keeps me up at night, knowing that I'll never truly escape the shadows we left behind. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, so I rented a cabin deep in the woods. My nearest neighbor was about a mile away, and I only saw him once when I first got there. He was an older guy, probably in his late 50s, with a rough look that made me think he might have been in the military. He had a few American flags on his porch, and I could see what looked like a rifle hanging on the wall inside his cabin. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time fishing, reading, and just enjoying the quiet. But on the fourth night, something changed. I was lying in bed, about to fall asleep, when I heard a low rumble in the distance. At first, I thought it was thunder, but the sky was clear. The rumble grew louder, followed by sharp, popping sounds that echoed through the trees. It was gunfire. I sat up in bed, heart racing. It sounded like it was coming from my neighbor's cabin. The gunfire went on for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Then, all of a sudden, it stopped, leaving the night dead quiet. The next morning, I decided to check on my neighbor. I walked the mile to his cabin, but when I got there, it was empty. The door was slightly open, and the inside was a mess. Furniture turned over, holes in the walls, and a few empty bullet casings on the floor. But what really got my attention was a map spread out on the kitchen table. It was marked with a few spots, and next to it was a note that read, "They're watching. They know. Don't trust anyone." A cold shiver ran down my back. Who was watching? What did they know? And why did my neighbor leave so fast? I looked around the cabin one last time, but I didn't find any answers, just more questions. I decided to head back to my cabin and pack my things. This trip was over. As I walked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes, made me jump. By the time I reached my cabin, I was in full panic mode. I threw my stuff into my car and drove down the dirt road as fast as I could without looking back. It wasn't until I was miles away from the woods that I felt like I could breathe again. But even now, back in my apartment, I can't shake the feeling that something is out there, watching me. Something that knows I saw that map, read that note. I haven't slept well since, and I keep thinking about my neighbor. Did he get away, or did whatever he was running from catch up to him? The more I think about it, the more I realize I was better off not knowing anything at all. But deep down, I know that whatever it was hasn't forgotten about me. Every time I close my eyes, I feel like it's getting closer. And the worst part is, I don't know when it will come for me, but I'm sure it will. It's just a matter of time before it finds me. And when it does, there won't be anywhere left to hide. I was alone in the cabin with my stepbrother, Tom. We were supposed to be having a relaxing weekend away from our busy lives, but something felt wrong. The cabin was small and isolated, hidden deep in the woods. We'd stayed here before, but this time it was different. The first night passed without incident. just the usual creaks and groans of an old cabin settling into the cold. I slept lightly, waking every few hours to the sound of branches tapping against the window. But the second night was unsettling. Around midnight, I heard a noise, a faint scratching sound coming from the roof. I told myself it was probably just animals, but the noise kept getting louder. Unable to sleep, I decided to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The moon was full, casting a pale light over the forest. The scratching sound had stopped. I looked at the roof but found nothing unusual. I tried to brush off my worry and went back inside. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps moving around the cabin. Tom was asleep in the other room, and these footsteps didn't match his usual movements. I quietly got out of bed and checked the cabin, but everything seemed normal. The door was locked, and the windows were secure. Just as I was about to head back to bed, I noticed something strange. The front door, which I was sure I'd locked, was slightly open. My heart pounded as I pushed the door wider and saw fresh footprints in the dirt outside. They were too small to be Tom's, and they led into the forest. I knew we had to leave fast. I woke Tom and told him what I found. We packed our things quickly and drove away from the cabin, the forest disappearing behind us. The whole drive back, I felt like we were being watched, and that feeling didn't go away. When we finally got home and looked at the footage from the cabin's security camera, it was disturbing. Someone had come close to the cabin that night, but the camera had been messed with, and the footage was mostly broken. We could see only blurry shapes and shadows, nothing clear. We never went back to that cabin. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was waiting for us in those woods. The cabin had been our escape, but now it feels like a place where something dark and dangerous lurks, always just out of sight. It haunts me, knowing that whatever was there might still be watching, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor. I was thrilled to spend the weekend at my grandfather's cabin out in the woods. I had great memories of the place from when I was younger. Days of hiking through the trees and nights sitting by the fire. Now, at 17, I needed a break from the busy city life. When I got there, the cabin looked just like I remembered. Old and weathered, sitting at the edge of a thick forest. Since there was no electricity, I brought a lantern and some candles. After getting settled, I spent the afternoon checking out the area and getting things ready for the night. As night fell, the forest filled with odd sounds. I wasn't scared. I knew the noises of the woods. But tonight, the rustling of leaves felt louder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my imagination. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint scratching noise from outside. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon or another animal, but the noise didn't stop. It got louder and more insistent, as if something or someone was trying to get in. My heart started pounding. I grabbed the lantern and looked out the small window. The light cut through the dark, showing only trees. I decided to check it out, thinking maybe an animal was stuck somewhere. I put on my boots and went outside, holding the lantern to light my way. The scratching sound was now mixed with a soft thud, like something heavy being dragged. I followed the noise to the back of the cabin and found the source. There was a big hole in the ground recently dug, and the dirt around it was disturbed. I immediately thought that someone might have been trying to bury something or someone. I felt a chill as I realized how alone and exposed I was. Anyone could have been hiding in the forest, watching me. I quickly went back inside, locked the door, and set the lantern by the window. The scratching continued, but I felt a bit safer inside. I stayed up all night, listening to every little sound and jumping at each creak. By morning, the scratching had stopped. I didn't see anything unusual outside, but the hole was still there. I packed my things quickly and left. I didn't tell anyone what happened, thinking it was better to keep it to myself. When I got home, I looked up the area and found out it had a history of vandalism and strange happenings. That made the night at the cabin even creepier. I never went back to the cabin. The night's experience left me with a cold, unsettling realization. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't the noises or the dark, but the thought that someone or something was out there, waiting for the right moment to come closer. My grandmother's cabin was isolated deep in the woods, a place I used to visit as a kid. After she passed away, I inherited it. I hadn't been back in years, but I decided to spend a few days there, hoping to relive some old memories. The cabin looked just like I remembered, old and worn with wooden walls and creaky floors. I unpacked my stuff and settled in. The first night was quiet. The only sounds were leaves rustling and the occasional hoot of an owl. The second night, I woke up to a strange noise outside, like a soft thud. At first, I thought it was an animal, but when it happened again, I got curious. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to check. The thuds were coming from the old shed behind the cabin. The shed had always been locked and unused, a leftover from my grandmother's time. I carefully walked over, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. The door was slightly open. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. Inside, the shed was full of old tools and boxes. The thuds were louder now, coming from the corner where a big tarp was covering something. My heart pounded as I lifted the tarp. Underneath was a wooden crate, old and beaten up. I opened it with shaky hands. The crate held old newspapers, dusty photos, and some odd items. A rusty knife, a few old coins, and a broken locket. As I was about to close the crate, I noticed something else, a small leather journal. I opened the journal, and the pages were filled with my grandmother's handwriting. She wrote about her life, her happiness, and her fears. The entries were normal until they started to get dark. She wrote about feeling watched, strange noises at night, and a growing fear. The last few pages were especially chilling. She mentioned a man she was scared of, someone who had followed her from town and seemed to be lurking around the cabin. Reading it, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The noises outside had stopped, and everything was eerily quiet. I stayed up the rest of the night, my mind racing with the thought that someone might be out there, just like my grandmother had feared. The next morning, I checked around the cabin more closely. I found some footprints near the shed, faint but clearly human. It hit me that my grandmother's fears might have been real, and someone could still be out here. I packed up my things quickly, feeling a deep sense of unease. As I left, I locked the cabin behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. It seemed peaceful, but I knew better. I never went back to the cabin. I made sure it was properly secured, but the journal and the footprints left me with a lingering fear. The cabin became a haunting reminder that sometimes the things we fear the most are closer than we want to admit. It was clear to me that my grandmother's fears were real, and whatever she had been scared of was still out there, waiting. I needed to get away from the city, so I found the oldest cabin I could rent out in a far part of the woods. It was miles away from anything, surrounded by trees and complete silence. The cabin looked ancient, with dark, worn out wood that creaked whenever the wind blew. Inside, it was just as basic. No electricity, only an old stove that used wood, and a few candles. The floor was uneven, and the air smelled of damp wood and age. The first night was quiet, but on the second day, strange things started happening. It began when I went out to collect firewood. I saw a stack of logs already cut and neatly piled up against the cabin wall. I hadn't done it, and I was sure nobody else was around. The closest town was miles away, and I hadn't seen anyone since I got there. That night, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like it was trying to tear the cabin apart. I could hear branches snapping outside and the old wood groaning under the pressure. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard something, a light tapping like someone was knocking on the walls. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I found something else strange. The front door was wide open, swinging on its rusty hinges. I knew I had locked it before bed. The ground outside was wet and muddy from the storm, but there were no footprints leading to or from the door. It didn't add up. I felt like someone was watching me. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I decided to take a walk, hoping some fresh air would help. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something odd. There were no sounds. No birds, no bugs, nothing. Just the crunch of my footsteps on the leaves. The deeper I went, the more I felt like something was pulling me in a certain direction. I stumbled across an old trail that I hadn't seen before. It was overgrown, almost hidden, but something about it made me keep walking. I followed it for what felt like hours until I reached a clearing. In the middle of the clearing was another cabin, even older and more broken down than the one I was staying in. It looked like no one had touched it for decades, maybe longer. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The door to this cabin was hanging open, just like mine had been. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floor was covered in dirt and broken wood. It was dark inside, but something in the corner caught my eye. It was an old, cracked mirror, the glass dirty and cloudy. As I got closer, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were faint handprints on the glass, like someone had pressed their hands against it from the inside. My heart started pounding. I turned to leave, but something stopped me in my tracks. In the reflection of the mirror, I saw the shape of a person standing behind me. I spun around, but there was nobody there. The cabin was empty, just like it was when I walked in. I looked back at the mirror, and the figure was gone. I didn't waste any time. I ran out of there as fast as I could, heading back to my cabin, thinking I'd be safe there. But when I got back, something was off. The firewood was gone, the door was shut tight, and the windows were closed. It was like I had never left, but I knew I had. My head was spinning as I tried to figure out what was going on, but nothing made sense. I knew I couldn't stay there another night. I quickly packed my stuff and left, driving away from that cabin as fast as possible. As I reached the edge of the woods, I looked in my rearview mirror, and my heart nearly stopped. In the distance, I could see that old cabin I found deep in the woods. It was standing right where my cabin had been. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but then, right before my eyes, it vanished, like it was never there at all. But the worst part was when I glanced at the passenger seat. The old mirror from the cabin was sitting there, the glass covered in fresh handprints. I had been counting down the days to my weekend at the cabin. Work had been wearing me down, and the idea of getting away from everything for a few days in a quiet, far-off place sounded like exactly what I needed. The cabin belonged to a friend of mine who hardly ever used it. When he offered it to me, I didn't hesitate to take him up on it. The cabin was deep in the woods, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. The road that led to it was narrow and twisted, with trees pressing in on both sides. By the time I finally arrived, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin itself was small but warm, with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen, and just one bedroom. It was simple, but it was perfect for what I needed. The first night was quiet. I made a quick dinner, read a little by the fire, and went to bed early. The stillness of the woods felt calming, and I fell asleep easily. The next day, I spent most of my time outside, checking out the area around the cabin. The woods were thick with lots of undergrowth that made it easy to get turned around. I made sure to keep the cabin in sight as I walked, not wanting to get lost. As the day went on, though, I started to feel uneasy, like someone was watching me. Every now and then, I thought I heard something moving in the trees, but whenever I looked, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me because I was alone in a strange place. That night, the uneasy feeling didn't go away. I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. The woods, which had felt so peaceful the night before, now seemed to be hiding something. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling just kept getting stronger as the hours passed. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The cabin was completely dark, and every creak of the wood or rustle of the wind outside made me jump. At some point in the night, I heard a noise that made my heart skip a beat. It was soft at first, a faint scratching sound coming from the kitchen. I froze, listening closely. The scratching kept going, getting louder, more insistent. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. It had to be an animal, I told myself, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel that had gotten inside somehow. But the more I listened, the less I believed that. The scratching sounded too deliberate, like someone was trying to get in. I slowly got out of bed and crept toward the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching stopped as soon as I walked into the room. I stood there in the dark, listening, waiting for something to happen. But there was nothing, just silence. I checked the doors and windows, making sure they were all locked. They were. I even looked outside, shining a flashlight into the darkness, but I didn't see anything unusual. Eventually, I convinced myself that it had to be some kind of animal and went back to bed. But I couldn't sleep. Every little sound put me on edge, and I spent the rest of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling. The next morning, I felt drained and jittery. The scratching sound from the night before was still stuck in my head, but there was no sign of anything strange in the cabin. I decided to cut my trip short and leave that day. I packed up quickly and loaded everything into the car. As I was about to leave, I took one last look around the cabin. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On the outside of the front door, just below the window, there were deep scratches in the wood. They were fresh. The wood beneath the paint was raw and exposed. The marks were too big to have been made by any small animal. They looked like someone had been trying to claw their way inside. A cold shiver ran through me as I realized how close I had been to something dangerous. I hurried into my car and drove away as fast as I could, leaving the cabin and whatever had been out there far behind. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had been to whatever was out there. The scratches on the door were proof that something had been there, something I couldn't see or hear. It had been close enough to touch the cabin, close enough to almost get inside while I was sleeping, completely unaware of how much danger I was in. That was the last time I ever went to that cabin. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about those scratches and wonder what would have happened if whatever it was had made it inside. Would I even be here to tell the story? I'll never know, and that's what haunts me the most. Something was out there in those woods, something real, and it almost got me.